Okay, if you're a subscriber to my channel or you watch my videos, you're probably someone who is either a photographer or who has a keen interest in photography. But I think this video will apply to pretty much anyone in a career or who does anything as a hobby where you make something creative. Let me explain. Okay, so let me ask you a question. Are you in danger of being sued for plagiarism? So most of you are probably going, no, absolutely not. I couldn't get sued for plagiarism because all my work is completely original. It's all out of my head. I don't copy other people. Well, that's what I thought about my work until last year when I got into some serious trouble for something I didn't even realise I was doing. So to explain this, first we need to start with a story about two different Beatles. So back in the reasonably early days of the Beatles, Paul McCartney woke up one morning with a song in his head that he'd remembered, and luckily he slept like most of us do with a piano next to his bed. So he got out and he said to his girlfriend, "Hey, Jane Asher, my girlfriend at the time, what is this song?" But he probably played it better than that because he was in the Beatles and I'm not in the Beatles. But she didn't recognise it. And so he took it to John Lennon and he played it to him and he didn't recognise it. Then to George Martin and he didn't recognise it. Then he went round to a load of different people that he knew, loads of music producers, trying to find out what this tune was that he'd remembered. In an interview he said, "For about a month I went round to people in the music business and asked them whether they had heard it before, and eventually it became like handing something in to the police. I thought if no one claimed it after a few weeks, then I could have it." And so eventually, after being convinced for so long that he'd heard this song before, he came to the realisation that he'd actually made it up. And so Yesterday was born, which is one of the most critically acclaimed and well-known Beatles songs we have. But in the writing of it, Paul McCartney's brain had played a trick on him by generating a false memory. And this leads me to the story of George Harrison. So the George Harrison story is similar to Paul's in the way that his memory played a trick on him, but it's not quite so positive. In 1970, Harrison released a song called My Sweet Lord, which was a very successful UK single, but on the 10th of February 1971, a lawsuit was filed against Harrison alleging copyright infringement of Ronnie Mac's song He's So Fine, which was a song made famous by the Chiffons. While the overall feel and structure of these songs is quite different, there's a chord progression and a melodic sequence in them that bears quite a significant similarity, and it was enough to find Harrison guilty of plagiarism, and he had to pay quite a significant amount in damages. But what's interesting about this case is that while Harrison admits there is a similarity and that he was aware of the Chiffons song, he still believed his composition to be original. Even the court accepted this explanation. The judge said, "Did Harrison deliberately use the music of He's So Fine? I do not believe he did so deliberately. Nevertheless, it is clear that My Sweet Lord is the very same song as He's So Fine with different words, and Harrison had access to He's So Fine. This is, under the law, infringement of copyright, and no less so, even though subconsciously accomplished." Now this explanation has cropped up many times in cases of copyright infringement, and it's a phenomenon known as cryptomnesia. Wikipedia explains the phenomenon of cryptomnesia as this: "Cryptomnesia occurs when a forgotten memory returns without it being recognised as such by the subject, who believes it is something new and original. It is a memory bias whereby a person may falsely recall generating a thought, an idea, a tune or a joke, not deliberately engaging in plagiarism, but rather experiencing a memory as if it were a new inspiration." Now this brings me to my second example, the case of the Sony World Photo Awards 2017, where photographer Alex Andresi was shortlisted for his image here. But soon after the shortlist was announced, photographer Anka Zuravlova, who took this image in 2011, accused Andresi of plagiarism by plastering this meme across her social media channels. The World Photography Organisation, who ran the competition, did some extensive investigation into this and eventually decided that it wasn't plagiarism, it was just coincidence, and Andresi was allowed to keep his photo in the competition. But what's interesting for me with this case is if we look at these two images side by side, this is clearly not a case of some borderline similarities like the George Harrison case. These images are far too similar to be interpreted in any other way than two versions of the same image. But for me, they're almost too similar to be deliberate. If you were out to deliberately copy someone else, there are a few very surface things you could change. The fact that the balls are the same colour, that the dress is the same colour, the expression, the kind of scene, the way the lighting is, it's all so similar. Any one of these things could have been changed or altered, and the photograph would still be as striking. But almost more importantly for me, if you're going to try and pass off someone else's work as your own, and you make a photo not only this conceptually similar, but also superficially similar, you're bound to get found out. So what would be the point in doing it? Now, I don't believe the case of the Sony World Photo Awards was plagiarism, but I also don't believe it was coincidence. I believe this was another case of cryptomnesia. And this leads me to my story, where cryptomnesia landed me in a whole heap of trouble with one of my clients. So, in addition to being a photographer, I also work as a graphic designer and as a video editor. And last year I was employed by a company to create a showcase video that talked about the story of how a brand was created for one of their clients. So I looked at a load of sources, a load of other branding videos, kind of picked influences all over the place, kind of brought together in my head how this was going to be and created a video for them. They're very happy with it, which was great. But a couple of weeks later, I got a call. The call was from the director of the design studio that I'd done the video for, and it was not a happy call. Basically said that they'd seen another video that was really similar to my video, and they think that I'd copied it, and I basically had to do it again for them for free. And so when I saw this video, it was a real double punch in the gut. Firstly, they were right, it was really, really similar to my video. Any casual observer looking at the two would assume one was a copy of the other. But secondly, and this was the killer, I had seen this video, the video that they were referencing, a long time ago. I hadn't looked at it for reference for when I was making this film, but I had seen it and it had embedded itself in my subconscious. Now, while I wasn't consciously referencing it, I obviously had some sort of memory of it in my head, and this had influenced me in making the piece that I made for them. Cryptomnesia had struck. The negative outcome of this was multifaceted. Firstly, there was the loss of income I suffered from doing a week's worth of work for free, which is how long the video took me to make right. Secondly, there was the fact that was the very disheartening fact that I had thought something was my work, was my original work, and I was proud of it, and then I found out that it wasn't, it was derivative. Thirdly, and most importantly, my client believes that I copied something to try and pass it off as my own, which paints me in a very bad light with them and makes me out to be a dishonest person. And like the case of the Sony Awards, so many of the similarities were so superficial, it would have been really stupid of me to copy them in such a blatant way. So I've had a bit of time to dwell on this, and it's made me worry about whether I've done it before in the past, whether I might do it in the future, and how I can avoid it on future endeavours. And this led me to an idea. Now, before I tell you about that, here are 4 important reasons why you shouldn't copy people. So firstly, you're taking potential revenue away from someone else by taking credit for their idea. It's unethical and wrong. Secondly, if you're always copying someone else, you'll always be stuck living in their shadow. You'll never meet your true potential because everything you do will be a cheap knockoff of the genuine article. You can get in a lot of trouble for it, and it can ruin you financially if it's pursued legally. Fourthly, if you base your work on someone else's work, you'll always be interpreting the world through the lens of someone else's vision, rather than your own unique vision of the world that you live in. This means that you will lose that spark you get when you create something that is truly new and truly unique. Because when you see something like that, it's really exciting. If you don't channel your creativity through real experiences, your work will become subject to existing cliches. And what will happen is you'll end up making not awful work, but not great work, just passable work. Forgettable, passable work. Inspiration is a complex concept, and it's often closer to straightforward imitation than we might like to think. Our perception of the world these days is made up through the media we consume, and the work we create is generally inspired by thoughts and ideas that have been brought to our attention by other creatives. There's a strong argument to be made that the history of art and media is one long, unbroken process of imitation, each work being a slight evolution on the last. I think there's a fine line between where someone's personal idea ends and where the cultural zeitgeist begins. When does someone's idea become a style, a genre? When does it become publicly owned? Personally, I don't think whether something is plagiarism or not can really be boiled down to a list of technicalities. I think it needs to be about whether the essence of the original work has been copied, or whether something new has been created simply using a kit of parts from the landscape of what's gone before. But anyway, here are 5 steps to help you avoid cryptomnesia. Firstly, we need to embrace influence. It's important to remember that a lot of our greatest works of art and literature and photography and film and everything have been created from influence of other things. There's nothing shameful about inspiration. We should embrace the process, because if you try and hide from it, it will catch you up in other ways. 2. Get a second opinion. We should always seek as much outside opinion as we can when creating work. Cryptomnesia could strike you at any point, and it probably will at some point to a greater or lesser degree, and it'd be great to have someone else there to stop you before it goes too far. And we also need to remember that our natural reaction will be to fight against criticisms of similarities to past work, but we need to embrace the opinion and lose the ego, because it will only come back worse on us in the end. Thirdly, be suspicious of ideas that form too quickly and too comfortably, because things we've seen before will be familiar and they will feel comfortable. New ideas tend to take a while to settle in before they feel comfortable. Fourthly, learn how your mind works. We're all different and we all draw inspiration from different places. It might be a certain point in your life, it might be a certain style or certain genre. I think when you start to find things that you're inadvertently copying, pay particular attention to those elements in your work, because those are more likely to be ones that come from somewhere else. Now, the 5th and final point here is the idea I had that I mentioned earlier. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. It's just a theory, but it might work. So let me tell you about the blank canvas problem. So something I've noticed from working as a creative across various disciplines is that when you're presented with a new creative brief, you're given a series of elements and parameters to work with, and what you do with them is your blank canvas. The sheer amount of possibilities is daunting. So when you start to play with these elements, it's very easy to let them work in a way that feels right. But the reason it feels right normally is because it's familiar. This way you end up creating something that was already being created. But what if we didn't start with a blank canvas? What if we started with an existing piece of work? What if we deliberately copied someone else's piece of work and then we intentionally moved away from it to create our own unique output? This way, we'll consciously be aware that we're working with someone else's work and trying to change it, and we'll also have satisfied that desire for the familiar. We'll already have that, and we'll be wanting to move away from it. Now, the Andy Warhol there isn't quite what I'm talking about. It's a very literal example, because his work was basically a lot of the time about copying and the ubiquitous nature of celebrity. But what is interesting is how uniquely his that image is. So I am basically telling you to copy someone else's work. For 2 reasons. Firstly, when you copy someone else's work, it's a great way to learn. Theory is good, but there's no substitution for actually doing something. But secondly, it's when you start to deliberately copy someone else, you are aware that you're doing it, and you're aware that that's not an acceptable outcome, so you need to change it. And hopefully, this will give you more confidence to try new things, and to try things that maybe don't feel as comfortable at first, because they are new ideas. So I think simply being aware of the possibility of cryptomnesia is as much that any of us can do. Also, I would say that when you find someone who's maybe copied your work, or you think has copied your work, give them the benefit of the doubt, because there's a large possibility they won't have done it intentionally, and I'm sure they will be absolutely devastated to find that out.